everyone, and welcome to what's going to be a really exciting side event conversation today on climate justice and fair shares, and looking at the moral responsibility of the United States in this time of climate emergency. My name is Doreen Stabinsky. I'm a professor of global environmental politics at College of the Atlantic, and I'm joined here by some of the leaders, the thought leaders in this area of fair shares, of what is the fair share of global effort, what is the US fair share of global effort to address climate change. We'll look at that. You'll learn today why that matters, why it matters that we look at the US in particular through this lens of justice, through this lens of fairness, in terms of addressing climate change. You know, the UNFCCC, the parent convention, agreed in 1992, said that developed countries were going to take the lead. All countries of the world agreed that developed countries were going to take the lead in addressing climate change, and including the United States, obviously. And it also says in that agreement that there are common but differentiated responsibilities to take action, and that those responsibilities and that action should also be on the basis of equity. So today we'll look at this question of common but differentiated responsibility. What is the responsibility and what is the moral responsibility of the United States to take action? What is the fair share of that action? How does equity, how do we understand the equity dimension of that share of action? We look at how questions of justice are fundamental and foundational, that without justice, there will be no climate action, and then that's why it matters that the US is doing its fair share of global effort. We'll also look at finance. Why is finance from the developed world so critical to understanding the US fair share? Because the US fair share is not just about mitigation action, but it's also about the provision of finance to developing countries to help with the energy and other transformation that needs to happen in order to stop fossil emissions. And we'll also look at what the moral responsibility is that the United States, and all of us are from the United States, what moral responsibility we have to lead. And why fair shares is an important way for us to try to understand that. So we have three panelists today. I'm going to start on my right with Christian Holtz. He's going to help us understand what is the U.S. climate fair share if we are using 1.5 as the metric, as the temperature target. Christian is senior researcher with the Climate Equity Reference Project, and I'm going to turn it over to Christian.
All right, thanks, Doreen. So what we are going to talk about here today, it's largely based on a project that a number of member organizations of United States Climate Action Network undertook over the last year and a half, 2 years, something like that. And that culminated first in the US Fair Share position of Climate Action Network, and then earlier this year in some of the groups coming together and articulate their vision for a US NDC that would be based on those on that work. And so I'm starting with the US Fair Share first, and this is, you can see it's the same graphic that is in the middle there of that infographic, and that is, I'm going to start with the results, do the other way around this time. And what the groups found by applying their methodology is that the US fair share of a 1.5 degree consistent global mitigation effort would be equivalent to reducing its emissions by 195% below 2005 level by 2030. And because that is impossible to do within the boundaries of the United States, they split that 195% target into two portions. A 70% reduction is done domestically, and the remainder done through support to developing countries to enable them to reduce their emissions faster than they could otherwise do. I'll explain it a little bit more in a second. Just want to start with that as context. And what the US Fair Shares NDC did, then building on that, asking, okay, what would that international support look like if we expressed it in, dollars, for example? The groups did some work on figuring out exactly this financial question, and this is sort of the result of that is 800 billion over a 10-year period, equally split between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And I will also talk about how that has been arrived at. But this is, again, a 10-year period. So going back, how did we get those numbers? So the starting point is, what does the world need to do to limit warming to 1.5 degrees? So again, this is like at this point of the question, it's mitigation focused, but to derive or to determine what the US fair share of that global effort would be, essentially there are two dimensions that are central to consider when figuring that out. The first is, how much of a mess did you make to, that's how we would articulate this ethical principle to our children. And in this case, it was considered as equating to historical responsibilities for emissions since 1950. And then how much capacity do you have to clean up that mess? And this was articulated as the income of a country, or each country, also known as capability or capacity. And crucially, in this case, and I talk about it a little bit more, taking the internal income distribution of all countries into account, so that we can actually consider the incomes of the poorest differently when we think about a country's capability to address the climate crisis than the incomes of the super rich. What also comes into later is not just what does the world need to do to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and what is each country's fair share of that, but also what needs to be done to deal with the now unavoidable warming in terms of adaptation, but also loss and damage and the like. So the equity principles, I already expressed them as like how much of the mess did you make and how much capacity you have to clean it up, are of course from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which in the typical language of the convention is articulated as common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And the other part that I mentioned of taking internal income inequalities into account, we find that in the principle that parties have a right to promote sustainable development, and therefore, we consider this to be taken into our framework by making sure that the incomes of those who are still suffering from the effects of poverty should not be asked to use their means to contribute to a problem that they mostly didn't help create. And so when we then apply these principles through our effort sharing model, the Climate Equity Reference Framework, and we have an online calculator, the Climate Equity Reference Calculator, that calculates the fair shares of all countries based on a set of equity principles, specific equity principles that users input. And so we can, again, for the mitigation case, we can conceptualize the global effort in 2030 as the difference that the world needs to make between where it would go without climate action, the baseline case, and the 1.5 degrees mitigation scenario. And in 2030, that's about 35 gigatons of emission reductions that are required to get to 1.5 degrees consistent pathway, and that is the global effort. And then we can run this through our calculator, and we have different fair shares of that effort for different countries. And not surprisingly, countries like the United States, the EU, that have a larger share of the global responsibility for creating the problem and a larger share of the capability to address it, have a larger fair share of the effort. Right? So for in the 195% reductions that I showed as the result at the beginning actually equates to about 39% of the global effort for the United States in 2030. So 39%, that number will come up again, so keep that in mind. And so, yeah, what the groups, the US CAN groups did actually with the capacity and the responsibility, when thinking about responsibility, they were actually quite clear that 1950 as a start date for historical responsibility is very adequate. Our calculator supports earlier dates, later dates, so it's an ethical judgment of how far back we want to hold current generations accountable for the emissions of those who came before them. But in terms of how capacity is counted, the groups actually decided to use 5 different benchmarks on how much the incomes of the poorest are exempted and how much more the incomes of the wealthiest are included. So I'm sure this is essentially like a graphical representation of these 5 benchmarks, and the bottom and top refers to the global income distribution. So in the least progressive benchmark A, the incomes of the bottom 70% are fully exempted, and that equates to an annual per capita income of about $7,500 US in purchasing power parity terms. And then the incomes of the top 10% of the global income distributions are fully included. And the incomes of the remaining 20% in between, they are gradually included the higher they get. And so that's the first one, and you can see the other ones. So they get progressively progressive, increasingly progressive, and in the benchmark E, for example, exempts the income of the full bottom 90% of the global income distribution, saying like, look, we have enough income and wealth at the top 10% to address this problem. Let's just see what that would do. So it's a defensible ethical position. And so on the right column, you see what the US fair share expressed as reductions below 2005 levels would be. So and it ranges quite a bit, but it's actually not that different either. And so because that range is reasonably close together, the groups decided to just use the median, like benchmark C, to represent the full range. Right, and so that's how we got to the result of the 195% reductions below 2005 levels by 2030 as the US fair share of 1.5 degree consistent global mitigation. But what about that blue wedge of international cooperation, right? So we have, as I said, the groups decided that 70% of that, or 70 percentage point of that fair share should be done domestically within the US. Of course, that contrasts to a 50% NDC that the government has put forward recently. So it's quite a bit more. But the rest is still is to be done through international cooperation. Yeah, this is the same thing next to each other. And so again, starting with the result, the groups decided that, well, yeah, this is what we got in the end. It's 800 billion over 10 years. And equally split between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And the way we got to that, we looked at first at mitigation, right? Because we have this clear understanding of how much the US fair share of mitigation would be. It's like 9 gigatons of that total fair share would have to be through international cooperation in 2030. That's like the second to last column, and about 53 gigatons cumulatively over the decade. And then we can figure out how much would it cost to enable mitigation in other countries at that scale. And we looked at a bunch of sources. The first one is the current project portfolio of the Green Climate Fund and the expected mitigation impact that it has. And we then scaled that to the 9 gigatons of 53 gigatons, and that is that is clearly an underestimate because currently the GCF and other other efforts are mostly still dealing with low-hanging fruit, and those will become scarcer and scarcer as we get towards 2030, especially on a 1.5 degree pathway. And then there are some other options, right? But that are much higher costs, up to $22 trillion over a decade for just the U.S. International corporation. So there's a large range, but it's large. Even unrealistically low numbers are very large. We then went to the adaptation finance, and remember the 39% of the global effort that I mentioned before. We used that as a fair share for the US for adaptation and loss and damage as well, that we calculated for mitigation. So because the US has 39% of the combined responsibility and capability, it should also do 39% of the global effort. And then we looked at the UNEP, for this adaptation finance, we looked at the UNEP Gap Report 2020 as the main source. And it reports that current adaptation needs annually, adaptation finance needs are about 70 billion in the developing countries, but will likely rise to 140 to 300 per year by 2030. And the report also enumerates several ways in which it acknowledges that its numbers are underestimated by several factors. So even if you use that for the whole decade, we get 1.1 to 2 trillion adaptation finance need in developing countries, and using again the 39%, we get a certain number for the US as a fair share of that. And lastly, for loss and damage finance, the 2019 Civil Society Equity Review on loss and damage has done some good work in reviewing the literature and came up with numbers. I'm not going to read them out now, they're on the screen. And again, for using the same 39%, we get to 634 billion as the US fair share of loss and damage finance need for the decade. And if we put all these things together, we end up with a figure for the period, for the decade of about $1.6 trillion. And again, our approach, our methodology to get to these numbers, we don't consider those to be like low estimate. We consider them to be numbers that are so low that they are clearly below the floor of an actual estimate of the finance. So it's just like, it's definitely not going to be less, and that's all we wanted to know. And so what the groups decided is to put in the Fair Shares NDC because there was also recognition, and Erica was going to talk about that a little bit more, that currently the institutions and certain other elements are not in place for finance at that level, that currently the US should make a pledge for a 50% good faith down payment on these 1.6 trillion. A pledge for 800 billion over the course of a decade, equally split between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Clearly not its fair share, but also we still need to figure out what the actual numbers are, because those are all not real estimates, just numbers that we know are lower than the actual estimates. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Christian. And I'm still shocked by not just the scale of the numbers. I mean, it's 1.6 trillion is quite a lot of money. It sounds like quite a lot of money, right? But it's actually, when we think about the money that we spend to bail out banks, or the money that we spend, in fossil fuel subsidies every year, it's not actually that much money. What's shocking probably is, to me at least, is the difference between what our responsibility is and the numbers that we're talking about in the single-digit billions, as opposed to the hundreds of billions of dollars necessary. To our audience, just to flag for you that we'll take questions at the end, but get yourself ready, because those will be questions where you'll raise your hand and you'll actually let us know that you want to speak. If you have questions for Christian, hold on to them, and after our three speakers, I'll give I'll open up the floor for questions. We'll turn now to Erica Lennon. Erica is senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, works very much on the climate finance, on the issues of climate finance, also working on carbon markets issues here in Glasgow. But Erica will maybe elaborate a little bit more on climate finance and how should we think about these numbers, how should we think about this gap between what's needed and the paltry offerings that are out there right now. Erica?
Great. Thanks, Doreen, and thanks, Christian, for going through the numbers and making it so clear. And as Christian mentioned, part of the US Fair Share NDC necessarily has a finance component because, and as Doreen mentioned, and as Christian mentioned, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement are built on common but differentiated responsibilities and on issues of equity, and you can't expect all the countries around the world and countries and developing countries to be able to both develop but also meet and do what they can do to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees while facing climate crisis, while facing debt crisis, while trying to develop and care for their people without providing them support. Because it's wholly unfair, which I think is part of the basis of why this is included in the Fair Share NDC. And it's really the responsibility of those most responsible for the climate crisis to provide this support and provide this finance. And governments have both a moral and a legal responsibility to do this. It's part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It says developed countries will provide this finance and this support. So does the Paris Agreement. It's why in 2009, countries came and said, by 2020, we'll provide $100 billion per year, which they have thus far failed to meet and don't have a plan to meet until at least 2023. And the US fair share of that, I think, is $40 billion, and they're nowhere near that. And nor do they have a plan to reach that. But as we've sort of seen, as the US is the largest historical emitter and has this obligation, they really need to be providing this finance. And this finance for mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention that today is Loss and Damage Day at the COP here in Glasgow. And so it's time, I'll do this to pay up for loss and damage. Because it's long past time and we are already seeing the impacts of the climate crisis, and it's not enough to say that you can adapt to this because you can't adapt to your home disappearing. So I'll delve a little bit more into sort of what this finance commitment should look like. And as Christian mentioned, the US Finance Fair Share NDC calls for a good faith down payment of $800 billion over the 2021 to 2030 period. And to put that in perspective, and Doreen mentioned fossil fuel subsidies and everything that we pay for, but I believe also the one-year budget, the defense budget for the US is around $700 billion for 1 year. And what we're saying is your fair share down payment to deal with the climate crisis, which is the greatest human rights crisis of our time, is $800 billion over the course of 9 years, and we're told that this is too much. And that's one of the reasons why the fair share calls for this as just a down payment, where we know our fair share is, as Christian mentioned, conservatively 1.6 trillion across these things. And of course, this commitment will have to continually be revised upwards. And yes, we need to still build more of the institutions and the capabilities of doing this. The Green Climate Fund, which was created coming out of Cancun 10 years ago or so and then operationalized, has had a budget basically of $10 billion because that's what countries have pledged for the first commitment period and for the second commitment period. And they've been able to spend it. And they will need more over time. And also, as we see, as the climate crisis continues, not only do we need the finance for mitigation to stop it and to keep warming below 1.5, but we're going to need even more money for adaptation and even more money for loss and damage if we don't address this and we don't address it now. And I think that that's one of the things that when you're thinking about these fair share finance numbers to keep in mind is that, we say 1.6 trillion is a low estimate, and there's the adaptation gap report, and there's trillions of dollars we know we need for loss and damage right now, and these are only going to grow. It's only going to get more as time goes on. But the finance isn't just about the amount of finance. It's also about it's also about the quality of that finance. Mm-hmm. And it can't just be any finance. It can't just be, here we're going to give you loans, or here's what we're going to do. And you have to really think about what that quality is, because you're dealing with people's lives here, and it's not just about sort of writing a blank check and saying, here, go spend this money, because that's not actually going to solve the problem. And so in US Can's approach to the Fair Shares NDC, we also talked about what the quality of this finance should be. And I'll start with the issue of it should be grants and not loans. So one of the things that we're seeing, and one of the things that's critical about finance is the way it's provided. And a lot of this finance is obviously going to countries who are facing lots of crises. We're reeling from a global pandemic that is hitting developing countries significantly more than it's hitting developed countries. And they need money to deal with that. They need money to deal with the climate crisis. They need money to, help their people. And the more in debt they are, the harder it is to provide those critical social services. And so climate finance really needs to come in the form of grants and not loans. And that's the first aspect, I would say, of quality of finance. And it also needs to be transparent and predictable. And so there needs to be a way for countries to say, this is how much money we're going to be providing, this is how much you can rely on. And that's one of the things that's debated in many of the rooms around COP26 and in Glasgow, is thinking about how you make sure that finance is predictable. And it needs to be transparent, and it needs to be reported on, and that needs to be able to be understood. So we know how much money is going to least developed countries. So we know how much money is available for small island developing states. And we know what is in loans and what is in grants and how to count that. And it needs to be transparent so we know what countries are trying to count as climate finance, so that they're not counting subsidies to, not that you would ever count subsidies to fossil fuel companies as climate finance, but so that we know what it's going for and that it's really going to the right things. And coupled with this, and I'll say this, that in addition to sort of needing to do this, we also need to shift the trillions that are going to fossil fuel subsidies, to investments in fossil fuels, to industrial bioenergy, to deforestation, away from those things, and we need to shift that money into growing the clean energy economy. And so part of the Paris Agreement, one of the goals of the Paris Agreement is to shift finance flows in Article 2.1c, which I won't quote to you. But we need to shift those financial flows away from dirty energy. We know we need to get to zero fossil fuels. We know we need to get to zero deforestation. And we can take that money and shift it into renewable energies and investing in the clean energy future that everyone wants to see. And this includes, making sure that money is going to the right institutions. Money is going to the financial architecture that's set up under the UNFCCC. So it's going to the Green Climate Fund. It's going to the Adaptation Fund. It's going to the least developed countries funds. And these institutions that are connected back to the Climate Convention, rather than going to multilateral development banks that we know, have a history of funding destructive projects, have a history of continuing to fund to fuel the climate crisis with their funding, but also, don't have these links to the equity lens, to CBDR, and so we need to make sure it's going to the right places. And then also on quality, what we need to make sure is that it's sustainable and that it's really focused and human rights centered and people centered and centered on respecting human rights, respecting gender equality, respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. Too often what we see with projects, whether in the name in climate action, actually having poor effects on human lives and on their environment and on their land. And so we need to make sure that when finance is going places and the climate finance is provided, is being done so in a way that really centers people, that ensures the rights of Indigenous peoples to their collective land rights, ensures their free, prior, and informed consent, involves real meaningful participation and consultation of local communities and Indigenous peoples, not just as a check-the-box exercise, but as partners in projects that finance is supporting, so that they're involved from the very beginning, from project design all the way through implementation and receiving the benefits, and involved in the monitoring and making sure it continues to be good. We need to prioritize gender equality and make sure that finance approaches are gender responsive. Human rights needs to be respected, protected, and fulfilled in all of this. All of the parties to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement have signed at least 3 human rights instruments, and this should guide their finance as well, because you can't have climate action. You can't say, oh, well, it's climate action. It doesn't matter that it destroyed people's lives. That's not helping. And so we really need to think about that. And so part of providing finance is also advocating in the spaces that you're providing this finance to, whether it be through U.S. bilateral finance, through USAID or the Development Finance Corporation or anything, or through MDBs or through the climate finance institutions, is that you need to be advocating for there to be rights-based safeguards, for there to be transparency, for the finance to be accessible to the people who need the finance, to ensure the rights to accessing information and participation, and ensuring the right to remedy, because sometimes projects go wrong, even if you can have a great designed climate finance project, but something unforeseen happens, and there needs to be a right to remedy. And so when providing a fair share of finance, you really have to think about the quality and not just the quantity. And the quantity is, of course, important, and has been historically far too low. And to put it somewhat in perspective, earlier this year, the Biden administration asked for $5.5 billion, and then recently upped it to $11 billion per year by 2024. And that's just so far too low, and doesn't account for the things the U.S. already owes, including, I'll highlight, the U.S. had pledged $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund. It gave $1 billion of that, and then the previous administration stopped giving. The current ask is not for the remaining $2 billion, plus what they would owe in the first replenishment, which would be conservatively a doubling of the initial pledge. So what the Biden administration should be putting in just to the Green Climate Fund is $8 billion almost immediately, and thus far I think it's asked for just over about 1.25. And so there's a lot more to go, and those numbers, you'll notice, $8 billion to one fund is significantly below what the US's fair share is. And certainly it wouldn't necessarily all go to one institution, because the institutions can't handle that. They're not equipped to handle the numbers. But we know that the fair share needs to not be based on what the institutions are equipped to handle or on political compromises, but really on what is the fair share and what will deliver climate justice and equity. And that's what these numbers are based on. And it's not enough to just reduce emissions. When you're the largest historical emitter, you have a responsibility to both reduce emissions, but also to provide that support and that finance to countries around the world who need it. And I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. That was great. I mean, Christian sort of set out that nice graph where, we've got the red wedge, which is the mitigation, and then that blue wedge, which is international cooperation. Yeah. Which is huge, and that's like a story in itself, but you've helped us understand sort of the depth, the many dimensions of that, the rights dimensions of it, the justice dimensions of it. We're failing on so many of those dimensions, right? It's amazing, that while you have the UNFCCC saying that developed countries should take the lead, the U.S. putting itself forward as a climate leader, very hypocritically as a climate leader because failing on mitigation, failing on finance. Jean Su is the Energy Justice Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. She's also senior attorney there, and maybe you could elaborate just a little bit more on the failings of U.S. leadership and where we should be. What should we be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's wow. We could talk about that for days upon decades of the failure of U.S. leadership. I think one of the interesting things to bring to light with the incredible graphs, the analysis, and the numbers is the racial injustice and environmental injustice and energy injustice components of what we're seeing on the ground in the United States right now. So I'd love to kind of unpack and tell that story a little bit, which will put into context how desperate we are to fulfill this fair share, both in the US and the world. And the US is just a microcosm, essentially, of what's happening in the world. So I think, even looking at this time period of COVID, we've seen just incredible devastation for Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, and other communities of color. So it's no surprise that in the United States, our energy system has extreme disparate impacts on people of color. And when I say that, and I say that it's a racist energy system, we actually have all the facts to back us up. So from source of extraction to the combustion of the energy, it's no surprise that Black communities in particular are 60% more likely to live within a mile of a polluting fossil fuel plant. What's also interesting is that when you take that, we have obviously disproportionate adverse health impacts for those communities. They are more likely to get asthma, to get cancer, to have reproductive disasters essentially in their health. So that's just one part of our fossil fuel industry complex. Then you get into the electricity system and energy, and that's a second dimension of our collapse. Black families actually need to pay 3 times more than white families in the United States for energy. And that's because so what we have in the United States is something called the energy burden, which is the amount of income a family pays for their electricity, so their electricity bill essentially, over their income. So of course, if everybody in the United States thinks that everybody's fair because we're charging the same rate for electricity, that's actually not true, because that will disproportionately impact a family that has far lower income. So not only are people getting poisoned from dirty energy, they're also losing access to energy at a disproportionate rate in the States. And one of the failings of COVID was a huge spike in unemployment, obviously. And we saw that Black, Brown, and Indigenous workers, again, died disproportionately from COVID. They got infected disproportionately from COVID. And they also were cut off from their electricity disproportionately from COVID because of their inability to pay, lack of employment, and low income. But then you tie that all together as well during this period, in particular this past year, with the climate emergency that completely blew up in different ways in the United States that no one had foreseen. So what we're talking about are the wildfires and the heat domes in the Pacific Northwest, the incredible winter surges that happened in Texas, which cut off millions of people all over Texas, and the hurricanes that led to actual death all across from Puerto Rico down through the northeast and the southeast of the United States. And again, the people who were disproportionately impacted by the climate disasters are those same people we've been talking about this entire time. And to give you a really vivid story of that, in Portland, Oregon, there was an unprecedented heat dome. Temperatures rose extremely. And what studies found is that Black communities were living in areas that were 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit higher than white families in Oregon. And the reason for that is because of historical racist redlining policies. People of color have been living in public housing in communities that are not tree-lined, and essentially that led to the disproportionate impact of a heat dome and disproportionately killed communities of color in Oregon. And that's just one example of so much. So when we talk about the climate emergency in the United States, it's intricately and intimately linked with the racism in the United States, because it's the same people who are being affected by all of it. So, when we talk about fair shares and what needs to be done on a domestic level to reduce emissions, there has to be a different understanding of how we actually deploy the finance and deploy how we are cutting our emissions. There's so much talk, especially during this federal session, about what are our climate solutions. How is Congress going to pass solutions? And there has been so much focus on the decarbonization, just cutting the carbon. So people do sprinkle in some wind, some solar, but there's a whole other amount, a huge amount of investment that the Biden administration is putting into false solutions like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. Those are all mechanisms and tools and unproven technologies that will allow for the fossil fuel industry to keep going. And the point of all of this is that, and there's also a ton of support for nuclear. And the point of all of this is that decarbonization is not the only game in town in the United States or across the world to address the climate emergency. This is actually our chance to rebuild, and rebuild with a truly regenerative and justice-oriented system. We can't rely on the same capitalist system of utilities, our fossil fuel utilities right now, give them the power to determine how slow this renewable energy transition will take place, and to continue to exploit and make communities of color all over the world so energy poor and unresilient to who they are. So, some of the things that we are advocating for when we're talking about decarbonization in the Fair Shares framework is building up a new system of energy that is anti-racist and that is essentially resilient. And what that looks like are not centralized utilities right now that are trying to roll out transmission lines and destroy the planet, essentially with ridiculous ecosystem destruction, but actually distributed energy systems in the form of solar and storage and microgrids. And these are actually affordable systems. They are systems that communities can have access to. They do not need to be poisoned in their backyard by a fossil fuel plant. And they're also essentially resilient. One of the most incredible things that we found in the United States this past year was that climate emergencies and access to electricity, essentially, were being threatened by these climate emergencies. And the only way that people could survive heat domes and survive the winter cold was through access to electricity. If you didn't have that, people were dying without electricity for their medicines, their life-saving medicines, their dialysis for their diseases. And the only people who were able to sustain that electricity access were people who had distributed solar on their rooftops or community solar next to them with storage packs right next to them so that they could survive. And I think that is a model that we need to think about. It's a democratic model, it's an anti-capitalist model, and it's a model that will restore a great sense of justice that communities of color in this country have been severely punished by, and it's time to rebuild. So this is a new time for new jobs, but also a new time for justice for the United States and around the world.
Thank you, Jean. So I'm gonna, that was awesome. Really thinking about, what it makes me think about is there's that blue wedge, which is international cooperation. But we also need a blue wedge of investment in the United States to address the climate justice and the energy justice issues that we face in the United States. Because without addressing them, we cannot be a leader, right? We cannot be a leader if we're already failing our own population. I'm going to ask, I have a question pending, but what I want to also say to our audience is if you have any questions, I think the guidance is to raise your hand, and the technicians here will link you up with us, and you'll be able to ask your question to us real time. In the meantime, I had a question, because the other day, I think maybe it was last week when Biden was here in Glasgow, that some of the US pronouncements of what we were going to be actually doing to address climate change were about leaving it to the market. We're just going to leave, we're not going to mobilize public finance, but there's all kinds of ways to mobilize private finance. And I think this is definitely linked with the conversations that are ongoing here in Glasgow about markets. One of the things that I think about in that regard is that markets. What we do is instead of mobilizing that money for actual transformation and having those needs and the priorities defined by the public in a democratic way, you leave it up to the market to sort of trade carbon atoms and trade carbon units. One of the initiatives, another initiative that was announced here was this Mark Carney task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, where they expect that, over the course of this decade, the carbon market will grow to $100 billion of just trading, pretty much just trading hot air back and forth, which to me seem, I think about those big numbers, the big numbers of like $100 billion, and how much transformation that could actually buy, right? Mm-hmm. But instead of having public guidance on how to spend that $100 billion, that $100 billion is now sort of wasted up in the air, just companies trading credits back and forth. And I wonder if any of you have any thoughts or reactions to sort of the public direction of finance versus leaving it to the market. If you have any reflections on the announcements last week, Biden, Kerry, I wasn't keeping track of all of them, right? Because there's a lot of spin out there. But there's also so much faith in the private sector and in the market to be able to mobilize all of these resources. And when I look at it, I don't see them mobilizing resources for the transformation that's needed. They're moving money around, but when we think about the energy transformation that's needed, when we think about the need to electrify transport, when we think about the need for us to, in the United States, to develop a new and robust grid that can handle renewable sources, et cetera, and deal with storage issues. And then, I think outside of the US, all of that transformation that's needed, it seems to me that there's a real need to get money to the right place, as opposed to just, quote unquote, leave it to the market to decide what to do with it. I don't know if I'm looking at Jean and Erica to see if they've got any thoughts, but I'll also bring it over to Christian, because he might have a thought or two for that question.
Sure, I can address it from a couple different angles, and I think we hear this so often, and I think it's a total shift in what they said they were going to do, right? So countries said, we're going to provide all of this finance, we're going to provide $100 billion, and they're like, no, we're going to mobilize it. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide some of it, but really the vast majority is we're going to mobilize it. And it's just shifting the responsibility. Like, let's be clear, the developed countries owe this money to the developing countries for the crisis that they have caused. Because the vast majority of the climate crisis has been caused by the developed countries, and they need to provide public finance, and it needs to not add to the debt burdens of people in developing countries. And sure, we know that the vast majorities of amounts of money that we are going to need for this crisis may not be able to come wholly from public sources, but the majority of it should, and we shouldn't be shifting or saying, oh, we're going to leave it to the private sector, the private sector is going to solve this. We already know that doesn't work. We've seen it fail. The private sector is not going to solve these problems. And as we're thinking about that, if you're talking about the private sector, you really should also be focusing on micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, and focus on those places in developing countries and how you support those, and how you make enabling environments for, micro businesses led by women, led by indigenous peoples, led by local communities, not thinking about like, oh, the private sector, big banks are going to come and solve this crisis. Because they're not necessarily in it to solve the climate crisis. They're in it to make money. And that's their goal. And so we need to stop sort of shifting this burden and relying on the markets, and we need to recognize that it's part of our responsibility and part of the responsibility of being able to benefit from the wealth that we have and that we've created and developed while also causing this crisis is that we have to pay it back. And as for the discussions, there are plenty of discussions here about the need for more finance, including the need for more adaptation finance and the need for more loss and damage finance. And adaptation finance has continually, and loss and damage will be the same, been a challenge, especially if you're talking about relying on the private sector. And it's lagging way behind money for mitigation because it's not designed to make money. It's designed to help people adapt to a crisis or to recover from the losses they've suffered from this crisis, whether that's, building a seawall or thinking about, how to make agriculture more sustainable and invest in agroecology that's not necessarily going to reap, vast investment rewards. And so it's not really set up that way. And as we talk about the markets, and here there's a lot of discussion around carbon markets and what's going to happen under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, but the markets aren't going to solve this problem either. We haven't seen that from the previous market mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol. I don't know why we would expect that from the markets here. And really, what they run the risk of doing is setting up markets that just allow for the trading of offsets around the world that doesn't actually reduce emissions, that doesn't actually help us meet the goal of staying below 1.5 degrees, which is what we need. And there's a real risk of that happening here unless, of that happening anyway, but a real risk, especially if there aren't strong rules put in place for the markets being discussed here to make sure that they actually contribute to the overall mitigation of global emission, to make sure that there's actually accounting rules to not allow for double counting, to make sure that we're not actually using emissions and credits that happened pre-2020 to meet our new nationally determined contributions, because then you're just allowing pollution to continue while offsetting them with things that have already been accounted for in the sort of global carbon budget. And I think that this isn't the focus where we need to be. We really need to focus on thinking through the real solutions, and the solutions that, as Jean mentioned, the local solar, right? And those community-led solutions. And we know that, women and indigenous peoples and local communities in the US and around the world have answers for dealing with the climate crisis. And we really should be thinking more about how to put them at the center and listening to their solutions than relying on the private sector or the market to save us.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any thoughts on that from Jean or Christian?
Christian, do you want to go first, or do you want me to? What would you like? You go for it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think your like last remark, Erica, about communities and so on. I think this when I hear private sector, I don't only just hear companies and firms and the market, whatever. I also hear households. And because that's also private sector, at least that's how I think about it. And I think there can be a lot, like there is actually potential there. I think enabling through public support households, communities to do things that they wouldn't that they want to do.
Yeah.
They're willing to use some of their resources to do, and they wouldn't but they wouldn't otherwise be able. And then the question arises, whether it is fair to ask them to use some of their resources. I think that depends on the context very much, and so that's in mitigation space, I guess. And in adaptation, I think what happens a lot is that there is actually a lot of adaptation already happening because people don't have the choice. That is like privately funded by households, right, by individual farmers or whatever, where you don't have the choice of whether you not want to take out that crop insurance, even though you can't afford it, right? It is, and that is adaptation, for example, right? And so that's clearly that we might conclude that it is unjust, and we might want to do something about it, and then probably replace that private adaptation finance that the farmer is doing by themselves with another source to address the inherent injustices of that current de facto model of adaptation finance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'd just add on to both of those reflections in two different ways about this question. I think one way to look at it is the private investment for the technology that we'll need, the solution side, I guess, and leaving it to the private sector is ludicrous. What we have right now are governments that are completely supportive of the fossil fuel industry, which is the private sector that has led us to where we are right now. And they are going to continue to try to stay alive and get that carbon capture working. It's a little bit of a lie for the government to say, let's leave it to the private sector, when both President Biden and John Kerry this week firmly, and Secretary Granholm of the Department of Energy, firmly said that they would invest tons of money into investing in unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage to save us. It's a lie to say that they're leaving it to private sector. They're actually directing private sector toward a fossil fuel future. And at the same time, we know that we're on a ticking time bomb here, everyone. We have literally 8 years left. We need government and true leadership to come in and direct this investment wherever it needs to go to transform the energy system, but all parts of the system. That needs to be absolutely directed by somebody who cares and understands not only the climate ticking time bomb, but the racial injustice ticking time bomb that has erupted this year with George Floyd and policing and everything else. So that's kind of on one level. I think the other level is to what you were saying before, Doreen, about how they did this week, the Biden administration. The Biden administration this week made some really interesting commitments. They promised to stop deforestation by 2030. Big caveat there, from 2021 through 2030, there's going to be a lot of deforestation, especially by President Bolsonaro and others across the world. So that's one. Two, they also promised to stop public finance of coal, oil, and gas. And that's great. That's actually a positive step forward. Guess what? A caveat there is that, there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no enforcement mechanism for any of this, but it's only for finance for unabated projects, fossil fuel projects, which means that any fossil fuel project that slaps on some promise of an unproven technology of CCS can still be financed. All of this is to say that the Biden administration is not alone, but all leaders here have refused to actually address the heart of the climate emergency, which is halting fossil fuel extraction. And that is a pure private sector thing. It's also a government thing. So if we really want to nab this, we all have to be extremely honest about the dishonesty that is happening here in these halls, and the continued refusal to halt fossil fuel extraction, to tinker on the edges with some methane emissions, to tinker on the edges with public finance from countries that aren't giving that much at all in terms of public finance in the great scheme of things for coal, oil, and gas, is a fallacy. And I think we all need to be really honest and upfront about that.
Yeah, really important to recognize that as much as fossil fuels are at the core of our problem, how little or ever they're mentioned in these halls. Mm-hmm. They're not in the treaties. they're not in the decisions. Fossil fuels, the very, very, very large elephant in the room, and of course kept that way by all of the countries, in particular those that have massive fossil fuel resources, like the United States, are happy to keep on fueling the fossil fuel industry, maybe stopping fossil fuel subsidies abroad, but not stopping the growing extraction of fossil fuels and production of fossil fuels within the United States. One more dimension on which we're failing our moral responsibility to address the climate crisis. Yeah, I had another question, and happy to have the audience chime in with questions as well. But going to you, Christian, you've been doing this work for a long time. Like, I remember the climate equity reference calculator. It used to be called what? The Greenhouse Development Rights Calculator. So it's an important message that you've been trying to get out there, and you've been doing it in all kinds of ways. And like a couple of years ago, there was a CSO equity review report that looked at inequity within countries and who's responsible for climate emissions. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. How does that manifest in the United States? You talked to us a little bit about that, and I'm thinking of this amazing Financial Times, okay, maybe it's not so amazing, but this graph that was in the Financial Times just the other day, which showed that in the United States, the wealthiest 10% are responsible for like 5 times the amount of emissions per capita. They have like 5 times the amount of emissions per capita than the bottom 50%. And of course, if you look at the top 1% and the bottom 10%, that disparity is even greater. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and how does that show up maybe in the red wedge or the blue wedge?
Yeah, I mean, it's, and you know, you mentioned the bottom 50 and the top 10, where it keeps going on, you know, as a fractal kind of, you know, like if you just think about, you know, there are people who would believe it are taking their private rockets into space, right? And the carbon footprint that goes with that, right? So yeah, it keeps increasing exponentially, I guess. And our calculator takes it into account, and we are actually working on a new version that does that even better. But we tried to get it ready for the COP, but we didn't quite. So stay tuned. Our calculator takes that into account. I mentioned that in the presentation that we exclude. We deal differently with the incomes of the poorest versus the incomes of those in the middle and those that are the wealthiest or have the highest incomes. And we do the same with emissions as well, right? So there is this long-standing thought in the ethics of climate change that the luxury emissions of the richest, you know, hashtag private spaceflight, should be treated differently than the survival emissions of the poorest. And so in our, you know, I showed you the benchmarks that the US CAN groups used and how they defined poorest as the bottom 70% versus in another benchmark at the bottom 90%. And we don't just exclude the the incomes of these under these thresholds from the income calculations or capacity calculations, but we also exclude the emissions that are associated with consuming that at that income level from the responsibility of the countries. So in other words, you know, like if the survival emissions of people everywhere, whether they live in the United States or in India or in, you know, any other random country, are excluded from the country's capacity, responsibility for causing the crisis. And so in the United States, yeah, we do the same thing, right? Like we have the same ethical, the same benchmarks, the same exclusion lines for all countries. So the poorest, regardless of whether they live in the United States or in India or in China or in Kenya or in Germany or in the UK, their incomes and their emissions are excluded from our calculations. And so and with countries that have relatively higher inequality, like the United States, that effect actually shows up. If you do that with an equally rich country that with less inequality, there's less exclusion. So we are the needs of the poorest in the United States are taken into account the same way as those in other places. Now, it doesn't show up in these red and blue wedges, because that is the national fair share, right? But it is, and I think we mentioned that in the report somewhere that it would be very appropriate to do the effort sharing within the United States along similar considerations of fairness, right, and justice, so that you don't want the US fair shares to be implemented and be paid for on the backs of Black and brown communities, right, and other frontline communities. So that's sort of like the next step. But our numerical model doesn't do that. It is something that that you then have to do sort of like in the great domestic work that a bunch of the other groups are doing around policy and politics in the country.
Yeah. Further thoughts on that? I'm wondering, so you two were involved in the launch of the US Fair Shares, and come back to the report that we're talking about here, which was launched around Earth Day, wasn't it? What was the response to the US Fair Share? Because I recall the media pickup was actually quite good, because we came out at the same time that the US came out with its own sort of new NDC, and we said, no, this is what the Fair Share NDC looks like. I wonder if you have any reflections on how well that went, and how we might continue that conversation in the United States around what our real fair share is.
I have to think back to that. Yeah, it was launched. It was launched just before, I believe, it was launched just before the sort of summit, the Climate Leaders Summit, or whatever we called that President Biden held virtually and at the White House around Earth Day, and so just before the U.S. also released its then revised NDC, and it did get a lot of there was a lot of good pickup around it, and a lot of good media around it, and I think there's been a lot of continuing discussion around it, and when people are writing about it, sort of thinking like, in evaluating whether or not the U.S. is being a leader in this space, looking and saying, but hey, all of these groups in the U.S. have said this is the fair share, and this is nowhere near it, and so I think it really can continue to serve as a benchmark for whether or not the U.S. is actually doing its fair share, and looking at what the U.S. is saying and what it's doing, and saying and claiming leadership on, and really looking back at this and being like, but your fair share is this, and that's really what leadership is. And I think there's a growing, I think amongst, sort of US-Can, there's a real energy, and maybe Jean can speak to this more as well, of people wanting to push the U.S. and for the U.S. to really do their fair share.
Yeah, I think one of the most wonderful parts about the US-Can response was that there are so many Black and Latinx and Indigenous leaders who endorsed the fair share, and I think when we've been discussing these issues, it's very clear to them the injustice of the climate emergency. They totally feel, as they are, like part of the same disenfranchised group of people who are suffering from all components of an unfair and racist and colonialist system. So I think that was really like an incredible democratic part of the fair share rollout. And I think it's also really healthy that a lot of the media coverage had the quote from the Biden administration saying, we're back after Trump, 50 to 52% decrease. And then everybody in the fair share community having a number to work with and say, sorry, that is completely insufficient, and that's ludicrous. And I think that's the strength of the work, that it has both the spirit and embodiment of justice embedded in it, and it has numbers that people can refer to. And I think we just have to keep pushing as hard as we can with those numbers to say, you know, you coming back from Trump, I mean, it's a miracle, but it's also, it's just not good enough. and we have no time.
Yeah, yeah. We have no time, and it really is a really valuable contribution to have those numbers as a benchmark, to have those numbers to say, this is what the U.S. needs to be doing in terms of mitigation effort. Because the U.S. comes to these meetings here, and what do? We point, you know, what does the U.S. administration do? They point fingers at everyone else when it's very clear that they are falling far short, are not climate leaders. And so to be able to challenge them with real data, with real numbers, with a methodology, and a methodology that's been tested over time, you've been doing this for a long time, to really be able to hold them to account. I wonder, you know, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I think maybe I should perhaps just go through the three speakers, see if are there any points that you hadn't made that you wanted to make, or that any ways to wrap up and to send our audience off with messages, lessons learned, things that they should take from the report. It would be great if they would read the report. It's online, US Fair Shares. It would be great to visit the website of the Climate Equity Reference Project and the Climate Equity Reference Calculator, and of course CL and Center for Biological Diversity. But what else would you like to tell the audience? Last words.
Well, things I didn't get to say. Well, I think that was when Jean was talking about. I remember, like, so you, Doreen, you also mentioned some of the other reports that have been done at the UNFCCC about fair shares analysis of the NDC of other, you know, a bunch of other countries, and of a great coalition of groups from around the world, and you know, I'm just gonna do a plug here. Last week, that same group released a report again of one of the annual, or, you know, we had a COVID hiatus. I'm still going to call it the annual report on the civil social equity review, and it was on fossil fuel phase out. So trying to apply, and it's quite, you know, interesting and challenging to apply the question of fairness and equity to the question of, you know we all need to phase out fossil fuel extraction around the world, like
now,
yesterday.
Yes.
So some countries or some places might need to go like immediately. Others might have you know, another few days, and some of them might need support, whereas others don't. And trying to grapple with that in the context of the fair shares and equity context of a large coalition of global, or, you know, civil society organizations from around the world was a very good exercise, and that's on civilsocietreview.org, and it's well worth a read.
Yeah, an excellent new report. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, Erica.
Sure, I'll pick up on that, and I couldn't agree more with what Jean and Christian said. And we need to end fossil fuel extraction and support, probably years ago, if we have any hope. But I'll pick up on a couple things. Is one, as we're doing that, we really need a just transition, and it needs to center on people, and we need to think about what that just transition looks like for communities and for workers around the world, and to really respect their rights and their labor rights. And we can't leave that out of thinking about this, what we need to do, and we can't leave it out of decisions that are taken in Glasgow, which brings me to, you know, we're all sitting here in Glasgow talking about, you know, the US Fair Share and what we're doing. And one of the things that is consistently missing, or that is often missing along with references to fossil fuels, is remembering that this is actually, the climate crisis is about people, and it's affecting people and their environment, and we need to center the decisions we make here on human rights. And we've seen this, what was touted as supposed to be an inclusive COP, being one of the more exclusive COPs, both because of vaccine apartheid and people not being able to get here, and communities from the global south and indigenous peoples being excluded from even getting here, but also the ones that are here being excluded. And they need to be centered on that, and we need to make sure that the decisions that we're making aren't paying lip service to human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples and women and labor and disabled people, and that really all climate action is centered on people and their rights, and that needs to be reflected in the decisions that are being taken.
Thank you. Jean, you've got the last word.
Okay, all right. I think, one of the things that people in the United States are worried about is how are we going to get this done? And it looked like, well, Congress has failed us, so we're doomed. And I think there's two answers to that, and I'll make our plug as well. One of them is that the president himself actually has significant executive powers, and he single-handedly can make a huge dent in halting fossil fuel extraction in the United States. He can single-handedly stop Line 5, Line 3, and other huge infrastructure projects. He also has the single-handed ability to stop the federal fossil fuel leasing program, which is responsible for 25% of our fossil fuel emissions in the United States. So I'd say that executive power is really important, and you can find our legal work on that executive power at www.climatepresident.org, very easy to explain. And the other part is, if you live in the United States, please vote. That's the only way we're going to get out of this mess.
Thank you to all of our presenters. We're out of time.